Well, hello there, YouTube. This is a pre-recorded video for the portrait painting tutorial today. So, the usual live streaming schedule is 7:30 p.m. to 9 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Tuesdays. However, I may have to switch to a different streaming schedule. Please stay tuned to my YouTube channel, and I will let you know updates. Also, please check out the online Facebook live portrait painting tutorial group. That's kind of a mouthful. Just check out the Facebook group in the link in the description box of this video. Let me tell you what colors I'm using here. So we have burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, cadmium red light, which this is actually Winsor red. It's a substitute for the moment. This is orange molybdate, Rublev color, cadmium orange, Indian yellow, yellow ochre, cadmium yellow, lead tin yellow. This is cadmium green, Viridian, Cerulean Blue, Pthalo Turquoise, Ultramarine Blue, and Dioxazine Purple. So today we are going to continue this John Singer Sargent master study. The link for the reference is in the description box of this video as well. Since I'm going to be working on this painting for numerous layers, I'm not going to oil out the entire painting. Instead, I'm just going to work directly with paint and no medium. I will just thin out the paint with spike lavender oil, which is my solvent that I'm using today. Though you can interchangeably use Gamsol and spike lavender oil. Now the palette is next to the painting in a similar light condition to optimize your viewing so that you can see exactly what I'm doing. So I used a little bit of burnt sienna. There you went. You saw I went right into Alizarin Crimson and then Viridian, and we're gonna mix up a little bit here. A little disclaimer for today. Kind of embarrassing, but I bit my tongue a few days ago. Yeah, a little injury to my mouth, so I cannot speak like I normally do. So I'm speaking through the left side of my mouth because of the injury. It's kind of the worst time I've ever bitten my mouth. Yeah, I'm gonna be speaking a little strange, a little off today, but I should be recovered pretty soon. So right now I'm just building up some of the color on the forehead. As you're seeing on the reference, it's not quite that cold, though the lighting is a little different today. So I have an overhead light. If you see the cast shadow here, I have an overhead light on the forehead. Oh, and it's something I'm experimenting with so that I don't have too many lights roaming around in the studio. I've seen some really terrific still life painters, Dutch master style still life painters, use overhead lighting for their paintings. So I thought might as well try it. If you're gonna use overhead lighting like this, make sure to wear one of these. It's a visor so you don't damage your eyes. It's not good to stare at the light all the time. So what am I doing here? You saw me mix up a color here again for the skin tones, and I'm just testing a little bit, just testing as I walk around. Now because this is a pre-recorded video, it is important to note that I will be uploading more videos in this style, pre-recorded, if everything goes well with my computer and stuff. So you should be seeing more content from me very soon. I haven't been uploading as much this week because I told you I bit my tongue. So it's a little painful to speak sometimes. So right now everything is fine. So I'm turning the form on the forehead. I'm also adjusting the color. As you see on the reference, that is a little more of a warmish yellow color on the forehead with some hints of pink in there. So I'm trying my best to stay as true to the color scheme as possible. You see this is a little too blue. And I'm building up the form. And that's what we're going to talk about today. In this tutorial, it's going to be building up form, building form in the painting. And I always talk about this, and I'm sure that other art YouTubers talk about this all the time as well. But for those of you that may be new to this concept, form is described most easily with value. Color describes many things too, but let's just simplify it now. So I'm just making darker shades of skin tone. As you see on the palette here, that's a darker shade. I am not trying to make a darker version of that skin color. Not at all. Every color change is indeed composed of hue, value, and chroma. Color contains hue, value, and chroma. Every time you change a color, you change hue, value, and chroma. No two colors are going to be different values of each other. They're going to be different colors. So Alizarin and Viridian. Viridian is absolutely one of the most useful colors to me. This is not an earth palette, if you notice. This is a prismatic palette, so that means that I have to work for my neutrals. I have to work for my earth tones. I do have burnt sienna and yellow ochre. They're fairly earthy colors, but everything else is quite strong. So I do prefer a palette like this, and I recommend that you always have a palette that consists of more pure colors for the very sake of your color mixing skills, your skill building with color mixing. When you build a color through the primaries, secondaries, or tertiaries, tertiaries would be more like earth colors, so just primaries and secondaries, you do gain more control over your color range. So for example, what am I doing going between cadmium red and cadmium green? When you go between red and green, remember, I'm going to keep calling this cadmium red even though it's a Winsor red. So just a side note, from this point on, I'll just keep calling that cadmium red. So what happens when you mix red and green? Now, a lot of painters use the terminology mud to refer to a color that is brownish, that is not appealing in their paintings for some reason. And I do not condone using the word mud. So mud is not a good thing to keep in the back of your mind. Remember that every plane change is a color change. Every color, for example, is composed of hue, value, and chroma. So there's nowhere in the color wheel a section for mud. It's just not true. It's an oversimplification of what happens when you don't relate colors to one another properly. So, when you're building up form, there's something very important to consider. It's probably the most important thing next to actually delineating form. And that is relationships between values and color. Now, when you're painting with color like this, you can't just think, okay, this is a lighter version of this color, this is a darker version of this color, this is a grayer version of this color. That's an oversimplification. So you must mix your color according to a relationship. There's many things you can relate, but let's simplify it down to just three: hue, value, and chroma. Value is how light or how dark something is. This part of my palette's really dark because the light is coming from up here, and things that are up here are brighter than things that are down here. But they're also just darker than these colors anyway. This is much darker. These colors are much darker than these. This is much lighter than that. The value is how light or how dark something is. Chroma means how saturated is it? Is it a brightly saturated stop sign looking red? Or is it more of a kind of vivid, not so bright red like something you would see on a brick? Like a brick red would be kind of more subtle, or a terracotta, something that's terracotta, right? That's not going to be as saturated. So, hue is the other thing that you want to relate, and that's a big one. How green is it? How red is it? How yellow is it? And with color, we use the term yellowish, greenish, bluish. Have you ever heard someone on the internet painting and calling a color ish, bluish, greenish, yellowish? What does that mean? So, as I'm developing the form on the forehead, this is very important to understand. You're thinking of each of these three components, hue, value, and chroma, all at once when you're painting. You can't avoid it unless you're doing an underpainting of some sort where you're pre-mixing a color and then you're just diagnosing each plane with a specific shade of that color. That's an underpainting. It's not a color painting. So, first, you need to understand that your brain is not going to identify different things simultaneously. Instead, what your brain is going to do is identify one component first, hue, value, chroma. And guess what? This is fine if you go with hue, value, or chroma first. It doesn't matter. Okay, so for example, I actually identified value first. So I'm looking at this plane, and you can see it really clearly on the reference. This right here is a lighter plane than everything else around it in this vicinity, right? This little vicinity, that's the lightest area. So my brain identifies that lighter plane first. My brain says, okay, that's lighter, I'm gonna make it lighter, but wait. The next thing I identify is chroma. How saturated is it? Even before I think about the hue, which is weird. Some people will think of hue before they think of chroma. I think of chroma before I think of hue, which is weird because I don't know what color it is yet. But I'm asking myself, is it a saturated color? Is it not a saturated color? Now there's some physics involved in why some colors appear more saturated than the other, but that's maybe a conversation for another day. So this is not that saturated compared to, say, the yellow, which we haven't painted yet, in his shirt. And it's not as saturated as, say, the red on his cheeks. So it is more saturated, though, than the gray on his hair or than the surrounding skin tones, in particular this mid-tone that we haven't painted in yet. So there you have it. That's what goes on in my mind when I'm developing form. And this is a process that seems simultaneous after you've painted long enough. However, if you're new to painting, you really gotta work for it. You really have to remind yourself. Hue, value, chroma. First thing I saw right there was that there's a plane there that's slightly darker. But in my mind, I ran through that process. Hue, saturation, which is chroma. So I went hue, chroma, and not hue, sorry. I went value, chroma, hue. All in my mind there, right when I was mixing. Obviously, you can make things look very realistic if you ignore the color and you just focus primarily on value. Sure, you can do that. That's fine. But the problem with that is the more experience you get in painting, the more comfortable you will be with the look of a not so colorful painting, and it will become a crutch. So the most important thing is to work on your weaknesses. Always work on your weaknesses. If you don't work on your weaknesses, you're going to be running in circles. And if you're running in circles, you're not going to improve in painting. Period. And it's the same with anything. Whether you're a pool player, a mathematician, a tennis ball player, or whatever, you're not going to improve if you don't work on your weaknesses. So that's pretty much all of the talking that I need to get done for explaining the reasoning and the mindset behind what I'm doing. So now what I'm going to do is I'm not going to talk as much, and I'm just going to paint. And just for the sake of today, we're going to model the daylights out of this forehead. We're going to push it as far as we can, and when we return to this painting, we're going to spend all that time pushing and rendering the eyes. And the forehead entails many important concepts that are just easier to deal with than the eyes. It's important to have a light brush and a dark brush if you can. Now I'm transitioning into the dark of his hair, so I don't want to add this value to my light brush and then end up having to clean it. Now remember, I have to work for my darks. I don't have black. There's nothing wrong with black, it's actually a blue, but I don't have black paint on here. So I have to go between Alizarin, Dioxazine purple, Indian yellow, Viridian to make a dark color. But what you get out of this is a chromatic black. Black that has a color to it other than blue. This is more of a warmish black. Now one thing you're probably wondering is this how John Singer Sargent, the original artist that painted this image, did he work this way? And the reality is, yes, he did work with direct painting. It means you're adding color into color and building it more like a sketch on top of another sketch. However, I cannot tell you if he used this exact procedure. He did work wet into wet, we do know that. And he worked color into color instead of building it up like an underpainting. But I cannot tell you if he, for example, did he oil out after every layer? I highly doubt it, but it's likely, it could be. I can't tell you, all I can tell you is what I've heard is that he would scrape off certain sections of the face and basically repaint them each time, what I heard. And we've experimented with things like that before. Nothing new to us. And in this YouTube channel, we really slow down and look at what really matters in a real-time sense. I'm not going to fast forward, I'm not going to edit anything. I don't really have patience for editing anyway. So you're going to see these videos as they are. And this is just how I teach my online classes. Except with the online classes, students have the ability to receive direct tutoring from me on their artworks. So I'm going to have a third brush now. I'm going to have a dark brush, a middle brush, and a light brush. The middle brush is basically going to be for the shadows. And I like to go between red and green, orange and blue. And as a result, since I'm going to be doing more of these pre-recorded videos, they're not going to be as long. But sometimes they will be under an hour. I suspect today is actually going to be under an hour. You can already tell right here, it's starting to look dimensional. That's what we want. Planes of the forehead. This is very important because this will help you guide your values. But don't rely on your knowledge of planes to paint. Instead, just use it as a check. Use it as a checkpoint. Because we all have similar anatomy, but it varies from one person to another person, which I'm sure Sargent knew. So this is the frontal eminence of the skull, this round area. Let's just simplify these areas on the side. That's just the side planes of the skull. This is the frontal ridge of the skull, which Sargent painted very masterfully, even though he painted it very grand manner style, meaning very loosely. And you can't really see it up close. Up close, it just looks like a bunch of random paint all over the place. But the frontal ridge of the skull, and you can see it on a human skull, is almost like the gutters to a roof right here. And they usually taper a little bit, but not always. But some people. This is the glabella, which is where it turns in towards the nasal bone, and this gives us the root of the nose, the physical beginning of the nose. Right on the side there, which we haven't painted in yet, and Sargent painted in with just a matter of a few little whimsical brush strokes, because that was Sargent's style. Right there, that is the superciliary arch. But it's different for different people. So for some people, their forehead is mainly flat, but they have very minute traces of the planes of their forehead. So no one's forehead is ever perfectly flat unless, well, I don't know. Maybe it is for someone. I'm not sure. But usually the forehead is never really flat. And you'll see a lot of hyper-realist paintings make their foreheads almost polished, like like this, like the palette, like a super smooth, silky, polished um, area, which is not the case for most people. But of course, there's always there's always an alternative. But anyway, those are the planes of the forehead. And when you put in a plane, it's important to exaggerate it a little bit. Now for the untrained eye or the impatient viewer, they're gonna tell me I'm just pushing paint around, and that's fine. That's usually something that someone will say if they don't really know any better. So what you're doing in this stage may look to the untrained eye like pushing paint around, not getting anywhere, wasting their time. And that's because this isn't a time lapse. And a lot of people these days, unfortunately, want everything right then and there, instantly. Instagram feed. Those fast-paced videos, time lapses, YouTube shorts, or whatever the trendy stuff is now. And this is not that. This is the real speed. And the thing is, if it takes you all day to make the tiniest amount of progress, that's better than doing a bunch of things really quickly and making no progress. And we're building up the impasto now on the forehead. Though we did use a lot of paint last time. I'm kind of tempted to not use much more because the more impasto, the more glare. But I just want to add a little more. And you can see a very profound highlight that Sargent painted. Use the white on your palette as a gauge. Make sure that your skin tone does not get that light, because this is like headlights. Even though on the camera this looks super bright, it's not that bright. And you can tell on the palette. See this? This is that. But this looks brighter than that because of the texture. Let's add some pink to it. And what we're working towards, which we're going to actually finish up once we put this plane, is a dimensional forehead. Appears to just emerge from the panel. A little more warmth there. There's absolutely nothing wrong with getting it wrong. If you have to make an adjustment, then do it. We want to keep some things brushy looking, because that's how Sargent wanted his to look. And there you have it. Much more round. Very dimensional forehead now. So one thing to note is that when we return to this painting, some of the colors may sink in particular these darks. They're gonna sink in and it's gonna look a little more flat. But over time, as we continue to build our painting, we will increase the medium that we use. And medium is something that I can talk about in more detail later. It's something that you use to manipulate the paint, basically to thin it out and manipulate the drying time. So you're either thinning or making the paint thicker. You're either speeding up the drying time or slowing down the drying time. But more about that later. So all of that said, remember, those of you that are in my online classes, please feel free to paint along with this painting and treat it as one of your online projects that you have. And definitely feel free to send me images of your paintings for this week's virtual classroom or next week's virtual classroom. Once again, if you are interested in taking your online art education with me further, please check out my online classes on patreon.com/upariartist. Online classes start at just $10 a month. With just $10 a month, you can send me images of your artworks on a weekly basis for feedback from me. And then, of course, there's other benefits to Patreon beyond that, such as the Zoom tutoring tiers and live stream tiers. So once again, thank you all so much for watching. I wish you all the very best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next one.